Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by Pantera Press. Barbara Sumner is a writer and filmmaker from New Zealand whose debut novel, The Gallows Bird, has just been published by Pantera Press. Whilst The Gallows Bird is Barbara's debut foray into fiction, she is no stranger to storytelling. Barbara's career has covered production of 3 highly acclaimed feature documentaries, stints in journalism and television, as well as the publication of her memoir, Tree of Strangers, back in 2020. Barbara started writing The Gallows Bird on a trip to Australia almost 20 years ago, feeling a compulsion to look into stories of convicts and their heroic survival, only to realise most of these were men's stories. It is in the pages of this remarkable novel that Barbara sets out to write Australia's convict women back into the history of this violent and oppressive time and what it took to survive, not only the journey, but to overcome their pasts and make a new life for themselves far from everything they knew. Set between London and Sydney in the early 19th century, this is a remarkable story of the best and worst of humanity, of tenacity and survival against all odds. And so it gives me such pleasure to have the chance to speak with Barbara on the podcast today. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on the book. What kind of feedback are you getting about the novel, and is it what you'd hoped for?
It's more than I hoped for. I'm getting a fantastic response to it, particularly obviously in Australia. You know, when you put something out there in the world, there's no guarantee that people will see the world the way you've seen it. So it is very gratifying to find that people do really seem to be enjoying it.
It was such a multi-layered, rich experience and so much about Australia's history that I didn't know. And having said that, I studied Australian history at university, eye-opening on so many levels. I just enjoyed that experience of being immersed in that world for the time that you took me there. So thank you.
Thank you.
As I just mentioned, Australia's convict past has been a source of great interest to me. But when I think of the kinds of books I read when I was younger, even while I was at uni, there was, as you discovered, an almost total absence of women's stories from this history. Thankfully, that's no longer the norm, and there are more and more books out there, books that are writing women back into the pages of history. But this story, The Gallows Bird, is not just about the experience of women in the colony once they were here, but also how they got here and about one person's journey in particular. So I wondered, Barbara, if you could start by telling us about Hannah Bird, or Birdie as she is known throughout the novel. Tell us about Hannah and her story.
Well, Hannah Birdie Bird came to me very, very much, in a dream, as many novelists talk about. She arrived fully formed. She very much fought against the world that she found herself in. She had huge dreams that really were not dreams that she was allowed to have. Her past was very murky. It was shameful. Her mother was an aristocrat who'd become pregnant, so Birdie was illegitimate. The mother and the baby were thrown out of the home, and it was a very bleak childhood. So when she finally gets to a house where she takes on the role of an under-laundry maid, first of all, she really enjoys that warmth and the fact that she's being fed. It wears thin very, very quickly, and the workload is huge. But she does, for the first time, make a friend and starts to move slowly out into the world, where she discovers that women are really good for one thing only.
Was Hannah based on a particular real-life character, or was she someone you imagined based on a number of different women?
She's based on a number of different women. At various times when I was visiting Australia, I would go to different archives, and there's some interesting women's journals that are available, and particularly at places like the Female Factory in Parramatta. So reading those journals was so enlightening to me, because they were the direct voices of women. And, what I always like to say is that a history without women is no history at all. I actually have my larger screen at my desk propped up by a copy of Robert Hughes' The Fatal Shore. And I have that there to remind me that when I first read that, which must be about 30 years ago, like you, I was struck by the fact that, women are in there, but they're there for a purpose. And the purpose is not their own wellness and well-being and growth. The purpose is to serve men.
Before we start recording, you mentioned whilst you live in New Zealand, you are of British descent. This story is a little bit personal in some ways because you discovered something about your own past that connected you with this story. Can you elaborate on that for listeners?
Well, I started writing this, over 20 years ago. And 3 years ago, I discovered that through a cousin in London, that in fact we had 3 convict ancestors. 2 were men, 1 was a woman. And the very interesting thing, her name was Sarah Moses. And I started to research her. And if anyone wants to go online and have a look, there's a fascinating little story about her where when she married, she got to Australia and she married and her husband abandoned her, and she bought her own headstone and had it made ready and all inscribed, and then she took her own life. And the headstone says, "Tell the world I died for love." And I just found that so powerful and emotional. And I could imagine Birdie being that kind of person, like, really, this is not good enough for my life, and standing up to things, although I can't imagine her taking her own life. But there were some other very strange things that happened. The very beginning, the very first chapter that I wrote, that's now about chapter 3 or 4, I think, was about a crime that Birdie is involved with. And there's a gentleman in it, and his name is Mr. Finkelstein. He's a silk merchant and a tailor on the high street in Whitechapel. And at the same time I found out about my convict ancestors, I discovered that I had an ancestor who had come to London about the same time from Lithuania, and about the same time the story is set. And he became a tailor, a master tailor and a silk merchant on the high street in Whitechapel. And his name was Mr. Finkelstein.
No way.
True story. I kid you not, I get goosebumps even when I say it now. There's that. It goes one step further. That was my father's side. On my mother's side, I discovered that the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose name was John Bird Sumner in the 1820s, is most likely a relative, an ancestor, and his mother was Hannah Bird, known as Birdie.
So you were destined to write this novel, Barbara?
I think so. I don't understand why or how, but it didn't matter what was going on in my life. I was constantly returning to it and dipping back into it.
What a fantastic origin story.
It's pretty strange. I mean, I feel like in some ways that maybe sometimes our ancestors, we think we are conjuring our ancestors when we do our DNA and our family trees and we think about them. What if it's the other way? What if, I think about Mr. Finkelstein and I think, what if he placed himself in my mind like a flag so I could eventually find him and sit at the table with these people and listen?
Barbara, half this story is dedicated to the situation that Birdie finds herself in at the tender age of 13 until about 16. She's sent away to work in a manor house. She's, as you said, she's without family. She's without anyone, any friends when she gets there, and without anyone to look out for her, really. Yet she's convinced that there is more out there for her, isn't she?
She is. And a lot of that belief comes from the stories that her mother would tell her about the manor house that she grew up in and her experience above stairs. And one of the ways I like to describe the novel is the opposite of Bridgerton. That glorious life. You don't see what it takes to support that life. And here we are, kind of, I don't know if people remember the Upstairs, Downstairs, which was a British TV series. It's like that, but it's a lot more raw because, in fact, the servants also are there for one purpose only, and that is not their own growth.
Now, Birdie has some incredible and practical skills taught to her by her mother. She's an excellent seamstress. She can read and write and also speak French, which is unusual for girls of her class. Can you tell us more about why you wanted to give Birdie these character traits and why was it important to her story?
Because her mother was of the aristocracy, she did speak French, she did do embroidery, she had to learn a lot of the other things that they did. They took in laundry to survive, so her mother had to learn those things. But the reading and the writing and the speaking French was probably the only inheritance her mother gave her. And I guess that's another very strange thing, that my ancestor Sarah Moses also spoke French, which was, as you say, extremely odd. And many of the women that appear, particularly on the ship and with Birdie and her best friend in the house, they don't read or write.
Another very interesting character trait of Birdie's was that she had synesthesia, and it manifested with her in an incredible ability to smell colours. And I've heard of this condition before, but not quite in the same way. And I found this particular form fascinating. So I wondered if you could tell me more about that.
That's a great question. So what I wanted to do was that I wanted her and her mother lived in a very horrible, dank basement. And that life before the manor house, I wanted to explore how that world opened up to her. And, things like smelling a strawberry. And because of the love of silk, they would take in laundry and they would launder silks and things. And things smelled to her. So she could smell these things and she didn't know what they were. They had no name. And as this other world begins to open up to her, objects become alive to her through their smells. And I think a lot of that is because that was so limited when she was with her mother. For me, one of the things I love about the novel is the dark corridors in the house that are like a labyrinth map of the house, where the servants it's only for the servants, and there are pinholes through to the rooms where the gentry are having their lives. And that is a lot of the way that the servants understood, the below stairs servants understood the lives of the above stairs. And of course, they go into the backs of the wardrobes where the clothes, the silk gowns are like an entire orchestra of smells for her.
As you've explained, Birdie isn't content with her life and she's convinced that there's more out there for her. And she sets out to try and escape Angus Hall and repeatedly defies the rules of the house to lay her plans. But misfortune befalls her and she is transported to Australia for the term of her natural life. And so a fair amount of the book is devoted to the voyage from England to Australia for women like Birdie. It's an account which demonstrates the extreme hardships, deprivations, and indignities suffered by the women on board, who in many cases, as we talked about earlier, were transported for no more than the theft of an apple or a loaf of bread to feed their hungry children. But, Barbara, there was method to the madness in terms of the policy behind this, wasn't there?
Well, there was, because the women who had committed crimes like stealing an apple, they would be sentenced to any like 3 weeks or 3 months in jail, or picking oakum and working on a treadmill, that kind of thing. And then the policy changed because the men who had earlier been sent out to Australia, and one of the reasons for the earliest part of that policy was that the prisons were overflowing. They were housed in ex-slaver ships in the Thames, and they were called the hulks. And the hulks were full of typhoid and terrible places to be. So they started sending men out to Australia. But after a period of time, there were no women there, and the men were all getting what was dubbed the Englishman's disease, which meant that they were taking their relief from each other. And this was considered very shameful. So an entire class of women, poverty-stricken women, were criminalized to resolve that problem that existed there.
A lot of the women, like Martha, for example, in your book, were already married, had children and families of their own. Pregnant women like Adelia sent on board these ships for this purpose. It just seemed so brutal.
I mean, it was brutal. Again, the women were there to fulfill a purpose. Their own families, their own lives that they'd had before that were of no consideration. So it was terribly brutal. And then you start to look at the ways that the things that women, and all the words for women, I mean, I've always found that really fascinating.
Yeah, we can talk about that now since you brought it up. Very helpfully, you've included a glossary of terms in the back of the book, because there are very many colourful phrases used throughout the course of this novel. And I counted them. There are no less than 13 different terms used to describe women, and none of them are flattering. They're all quite derogatory terms. And yet, by contrast, the number of terms used to describe men is very, very small. So tell us about that, and why do you think it was important for you to reflect the language in this way?
I wanted for myself to understand exactly the role of women and where a woman fit in society. So you were either a daughter, so therefore you were protected by your father, or you were a wife, or you were a widow, and that then you would have a brother protecting you, or somebody, your husband's brother. If you were not married, then you were in this very precarious state. And many women, for whatever reason, were without protection. Essentially, if you were without that protection of men, without what men offered to women, you were basically a prostitute. There were only two roles: the mother, wife, daughter, or a prostitute. And you could be a prostitute and a mother, of course. And if you fell out of society, even at the lowest level, then you would go to a workhouse. And that was not a great place to be.
It seemed to me that what happened to the women that were convicted of crimes and then transported, all bets seemed to be off for these women. And they were fallen women simply by virtue of the fact that they had stolen an apple or stolen a loaf of bread. I mean, obviously, there were some more serious crimes, and you talked about those in the context of this novel. But all of those women, irrespective whether they were married, whether they were widowed, whether they were unprotected by a male relative, all bets were off once they were on board those ships, and they were considered prostitutes by all the men that they came in contact with, irrespective of their behavior.
That's right. You could only be one or the other. You could not be a single woman, managing, getting on with your life. That didn't really exist, or it existed in a very minor way and not available to most women. I mean, the words that are used to describe women, I mean, a kind word would be a dirty puzzle, would be a very, simple word. A bint is a very, not a particularly awful word, but again, it's another word. A dolly mop, who's a part-time sex worker. We go through these words. A doxy. Women are only described in derogatory terms if they are not married.
Yeah. I just found this part of the book so fascinating on many levels and yet horrifying at the same time.
Sure is.
Now, your account of this trip for Birdie on the voyage out to Australia and the other women was both uplifting in the manner in which many of the women banded together to protect each other, but also rather sad and shocking. The powerlessness of these women who are forced into unimaginable situations just to survive or to get extra rations was overwhelming. So I wanted to ask you, Barbara, what kind of research did you do to bring these kinds of details to the pages of this novel?
I went to universities and as I said before, and a lot of that information is in the women's journals that are the few that are available. But also, how a ship works. And there's quite a lot actually also online that talks about the fact that to eat, the women needed to form relationships with the men, so they became their husbands. So much of women's behavior was out of necessity, and it was survival behavior. But everything was expected of them because they were in this situation where they had been condemned to go to Australia. So they really had very little choice. You had to eat, so you had to form relationships. Some of the sailors were good and some were not good. When you read, there's also available, ship's surgeons did quite detailed, their logs are very detailed. So I read a number of those and captain's logs as well.
Yeah, fantastic. So it seemed to me that everything had a price. If they wanted a little bit of salt for something, not for their own consumption, but to help somebody else, or to make a salve, or to anything really, everything had a price.
Yeah, I think one of the things I found really interesting was I did some research into women's medicine, into the kinds of things that midwives were using. But at the same time, the approach of surgeons and male surgeons and doctors, and the discord between the two. And I really wanted to bring that in, because of course we have a woman on board who is a midwife and has that experience, which would make her almost a witch, and the surgeon, who has a completely different approach. And so that a clash between the two of them.
There are some very difficult parts of the book to read in terms of what I thought was an unflinching account of some of the experiences of the women on the boat, or on the ship, I should say. Did you consciously not shy away from dealing with these issues in the book? Because, yeah, as I said, some of it was quite hard to read.
I actually toned them down.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Quite a lot. But then not all ships were terrible. There's a fantastic historic quilt that is held in one of the museums in Australia, and it was made by the women on board, and they did it all together. So you can see that from that there was a camaraderie between them and a support for each other. So as awful as some of the things that they had to navigate were, there was also always an upside. Relationships between the women were very supportive and uplifting. Not always, of course, because, there's always going to be some betrayal, and there is some of that. And I always think of betrayal as the meat of fiction. So we have a little bit of that, but it's not all bad. They are forming relationships and learning about the world as they move out of the structures, because you think most of these women have never been more than half a day's walk, if that, from where they were born. So some had never seen the sea. Birdie had never seen the sea. She'd heard about it, but she'd never seen it. She only went to the river, saw the Thames, not long before she ends up on a ship there. So these people have very incredibly limited lives where the world around them is very tight and very well known. And so they recreate a lot of that warmth and support within the worlds that they find themselves in on the ship and in the female factory when they get to Parramatta, those that end up at the female factory. And of course, not all of them did.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the female factory. So if the women survived the trip over, and many didn't for various reasons, they were destined, at least in New South Wales, for the Parramatta female factory. Can you tell me about that and what it was like for women who were sent there?
The women that were sent there were those that had not managed to secure a husband on landing in Sydney Cove. So what would happen is men with their ticket of leave, who had either worked out their 7 years or had done something that gave them a ticket of leave, they could choose to go back to England, but very few did. I actually don't have figures of how many, but not many went back. And those men were able to buy a wife, and they would buy a woman in Sydney Cove from the sailor husband. So that was always a little of extra money for the sailor at the end. They would then be married to that person who'd purchased them. And that marriage gave them the freedom to be within the country of Australia. So for men, the country itself was the prison. For the women that weren't married, they were sent to the female factory. So the factory was a prison within a prison, as it were. The country was a prison, and this female factory was an additional one. And at some point they, whenever it would get crowded, they would often do an auction of some sort to get rid of some of the women. But again, there they learned some really good skills. They were weaving and spinning and breaking flax and making fabrics that were then exported back to the UK. It wasn't all terrible at all. They had an infirmary, so women who were unwell would be treated. While it was harsh for many, it was also, again, a step towards freedom. And once they were able to be married from there, again, to men with ticket of leave, they were free within the country to build this new country.
There was an very interesting scene where essentially you're talking about this auction. There's a number of women, and the administrator of the factory has decided to hold an auction where she's going to get rid of a lot of the women that are there. But they've called it, if I'm not mistaken, they called it a mermaid's dance. Was this an actual event? Was this what they actually called it?
There's some dispute over that. So the women who committed serious crimes that were, of a significant level in Australia were often sent to Norfolk Island, and where also male convicts who'd committed crimes were sent. That's very well documented in terms of how harsh it was. Sometimes they would have a selection, and somebody who might be selected to hang that day would fall on their knees in gratitude because it represented freedom. The punishments there were incredibly harsh. The mermaid's dance was part of Norfolk Island, and I've been there, and I wrote some articles about it years ago, and I once described it as the most haunted place on earth. It feels like that there. So there is some, maybe not disagreement, but some idea. From what I can find, there was at least one mermaid's dance at Parramatta at the Female Factory. Maybe it wasn't called that, but there was certainly an auction or two. But the one that I've described is more, so I've taken a creative license because it is a very visual event and it fits the narrative very well. And certainly some women did experience that.
Barbara, if there was one thing you would like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
That friendship triumphs, that together women can endure and support each other and survive, and not just survive, but thrive. We have to believe in our own strength no matter what we're up against. And I think that's what Birdie and her friends show us, that they're able to do that. And if they can do that, we can do that.
Yeah, indeed. So well said. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, Barbara, as I mentioned in my introduction, you've had a wide-ranging career. You published your memoir in 2020, and then this is your debut novel. So I wondered if you could share with us a little bit about your journey to publication. How long did it take you to write The Gallows Bird, and then how long were you out on submission before it was eventually picked up?
Oh, good question. So over 20 years of writing it, just dipping in and out for a long time, and then about 3-4 years ago, I got serious and did a serious draft. I was able to secure a fantastic agent in High Spot Literary Agency, and they represented it to a couple of places, but Pantera were very quick off the mark, and they've been a fantastic publishing company to work with, very collaborative at all times, very helpful, never blocking, never, very respectful of the work. And that's been a fantastic experience. So that part of it wasn't too difficult, although they were quite exacting in their editing process, which I really appreciated. Having been a journalist, I was very used to being well edited, but they really took great care. Prior to that, I did my memoir, Tree of Strangers, and that really was, I wrote that in a very short time. I started that when I was in my 57, I guess. Everything else I did, producing documentaries, one of which was shortlisted for an Oscar, and I've done very well with them. All the time it was the writing I liked. That's the thing that made me most excited. So I wrote a memoir as a way of kind of getting over myself, I think. And then that opened up a whole lot of other things. And since 2020, have done a master's and a PhD. So, and those are in nonfiction. So I've been really enjoying working between the two types of writing.
Barbara, you might know, or you may not, there are many aspiring authors who listen to this podcast. And I wondered if you had 3 tips to offer writers who are out there looking to get published.
Don't give up. I mean, I'm 64. And I have this great belief in our third act, that women, as we get older, we're free from some other things and we're able to become increasingly free from caring for others. So we're able to focus. So I would say, do not give up at all. Keep going. Write a little bit every day. One of the most important things is you are your worst judge. Your critical voice inside your head is more harsh than anything anyone can say to you. You have to find a way to turn it off. And just, write. We all say it, write is right. Turn off the critical voice and write, and don't stop. Because I look at things I wrote 10 years ago, and I know my writing is so much better now. And that's what happens. The more you focus on something, the better you get.
Barbara, I was fascinated by Hannah Bird and the trials and tribulations of women just like her. This is a definite must-read for anyone out there interested in Australian history and women's history in particular. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.